So welcome everyone. Thanks for being in Jackson Museum. Happy Indigenous Peoples Day. I'm Jackie, the curator at the Sheldon Jackson Museum. We always start our programs off with the land acknowledgement and just some general announcements about upcoming events. It's good to see all of you here. We have an audience on Zoom and then all of you in the room. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Friends of Sheldon Jackson Museum, private donors, National Endowment for the Arts, Hanrahan Foundation, and others for supporting the Alaska Native Artist Residency Program. National Endowment for the Arts has been a huge supporter of this program for a number of years. Just to begin, we'd like to acknowledge and express our appreciation to the Indigenous people of Tlingit who have occupied this land for longer than any of us can imagine, and who, after 250 years of colonization in Alaska, are graciously sharing this land with us. Thank you so much. And we are pleased to have Denali McGlashan here with us. She's been here for just a short time, about a week and a half, and she's here until the 24th of the month. If you haven't had a chance to look at her painting in progress, please do so today. We also have, just to make sure it's on your radar, 2 different community feedback meetings coming up, including one tomorrow, October 15th. That will start at 4:30 p.m., probably go a little over an hour. And then October 16th, the day after, at 1 p.m., we have another community feedback meeting. And these community feedback meetings are in order to allow people to give input on the interpretive plan. We have a draft interpretive plan that covers things like suggestions and input for changes in the gallery, our public program spaces, our facility needs, takes a holistic look at the museum and makes a number of recommendations. We had community meetings earlier in the year, did a survey, and we hired a consultant, Sarah Asper-Smith of Exhibits Alaska, in order to help us with that project. So if you'd like to review the document, I can give you a copy. Also, you can find it online at exhibits. It's exhibit without the sak.com/SJM. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Denali. I'll read you her bio. She's a regional shareholder of the Aleut Corporation, Akutan Corporation, Tanak St. George Village Corporation, and enrolled tribal member of the Aleut community of St. George Island of Alaska. Her paternal grandparents are Vasa Nozikoff of St. George Island and George Alec McGlashan of Akutan, Alaska. In her talk, Compasses, Clocks, and Caustics, she will share her reflection on her journey as an Indigenous woman in heavily contrasting environments and the way her creativity has acted as a tool to speak to her future and past selves, digest the forces of the outer world, and self-actualize her own. She will be considering the personal effect of growing up in rural subsistence communities, the disparity between this lifestyle and her urban adulthood, and how these seemingly disconnected realms are in actuality inseparable. She'll consider the implications of researching through lifestyle in juxtaposition to Western expressions of academia. This will include examinations of connections between literal consumption, meaning food and subsistence, conceptual consumption, ideas and spirituality, and the ways these set the pace and angle of our collective orientation in regards to time, identity, and resources. She will reflect on what it means to witness in the context of monochronic linear time and polychronic nonlinear time, articulating the ways in which these different perceptions of directionality have molded her own approach to life, creativity, and connection. Denali has been wonderful to host. She's incredibly interesting and a wonderful, talented artist who comes to us from Australia, where she's been living the last couple of years. She's incredibly dynamic, just like her artwork. So here she is. Thank you so much, Denali.
Thank you, Kagalaku, for being here. Which is hello. So this is an oral tradition we will be engaging in today as opposed to a presentation. Passing along stories of life, culture, and connectivity are central practices to my cultural knowing. Prior to this talk, I wish to acknowledge the movement centered around self-determining people's shift in storytelling from a colonial-based format and narrative cited in Stepperton and McMahon 2021, Unangach researcher and my cousin, Dr. Haley Hannah Stepperton, articulates this well in her words. Telling stories with, by, and for Indigenous communities refuses Western and academic power dynamics that situate Indigenous communities as sites of extraction to an approach of co-creating research on Indigenous terms while centering Indigenous knowledge systems, co-creating research following a with, by, and for approach is an act of epistemic justice. My talk today is an oration in the narrative act of reclaiming Native knowing and addressing implications of researching through lifestyle in juxtaposition to Western expressions of academia. My name is Denali Taniluch Miglashin. My first given Unangach name is Chekta Chugudni, meaning rainflower, and given to me by the late Mary Bordakovsky of St. Paul. My second Unangach name is Tani Luch, which was given to me by my Anana, Aquilina Lestenkoff of St. George and St. Paul Island. It means lighting place. I am Unangach on my dad's side and Italian Australian on my mother's side. I grew up primarily on the Aleutian Islands of Umnak in the village of Nikolski, which is, there's a little map for you guys, St. George being on the Pribilofs and Nikolski on Umnak. I moved to Australia when I was 13, just because my dad came to Mount Edgecombe and he was kind of naughty. So I think he didn't trust me because we're very similar. I just want to provide an alert that there will be pictures of deceased people in this presentation. And there's Nikolski. Now, I thought Nikolski was part of the Rat Islands, but I think it's part of the Fox Islands. I'm unsure now. But anyways, so Nikolski, when I lived there, had around 40 people on it. Now it's about 31. Vinny Lestenkoff gave me that number just 10 minutes ago, which is nice. The pre-Russian population of the Aleutian Islands, which Nikolski belongs to, has been recorded as over 20,000 inhabitants, and carbon dating at Anangula place the inhabitants around 14,000 years ago. Post-Russian populations on the islands were as low as 600. That's just from the front of the village. My dad took this one. And there's the Orthodox Church. And this is St. George. St. George Island forms part of two islands called the Pribilof Islands, or Tanakh Amich, land of mother's brother. Though Western literature states the Pribilof Islands were not inhabited at the time the Russian fur traders arrived on the islands, Unangach folklore has narrative of Unangach people not only knowing of these seal-bearing islands, but having legends of journeys to these remote islands in the Bering Sea. In the 1700s, Unangach were forcibly taken from their Aleutian homes by the Russian fur traders and relocated as slaves to harvest seals. After the sale of Alaska from Russia to the US in 1867, the Unangach then continued as wards of the state of Alaska and remained in servitude to harvest, hang on, I just need my little paper because I'm losing my track. Harvest seals. After the sale of Alaska from Russia to the US, Pribilovian Unangach were given food, housing, and medical care. They were barred from owning their own homes until 1966. Another important comment to add is the introduction of reindeer to these remote islands was by Sheldon Jackson. When I lived on St. George Island, the population was around 200, down from 600 or so. Today, the population of St. George has further dropped down to around 50. There are more birds and seals than people, with nearly 2.5 million nesting seabirds and 1 million breeding fur seals arriving on the islands every year. As Unangach people, the early era of contact with the Russians, sickness wiped out nearly 80% of us. Today, according to the 2000 census, 11,941 people identified as being Unangach, while 17,000 identified as having partial Unangach ancestry. Primarily, the food source on both islands is subsistence, like many rural communities in Alaska. The generational relationship to land and environment is symbiotic and crucial. I grew up with my dad mainly hunting for reindeer, seal, and fishing. My grandfather also a fisherman. Amongst many other seasonal jobs, my father was a crew member of crab processors on the Aleutian chain before later working under biologist Dr. Roger Gentry's Northern Fur Seal program. His role was that of capturing seals and training them for observation in captivity until 1977, a project that would later see Dr. Gentry recognized as a leader in marine mammal research. These are some photos my dad took of the rookeries during that time. Here. These are kawach sea lions. And this is an albino seal pup that they took in. Unfortunately, it was blind. So in 1984, my father worked for the National Marine Fisheries Service, tending to the fur seal rookery on St. George Island. He also, on his own accord, hunted and monitored the population of the Sheldon-Jackson reindeer on St. George Island for the purpose of both population control and subsistence. The population control was for the purpose of reducing the chance of starvation of the herd on such a small amount of tundra and to attempt to limit the damage done to the native lichen on the island. In 1990, he became the harbor master for St. George Island and later worked as a big game hunting guide on Santa Rosa in the Channel Islands. So the two on the, which would be your left, is the Santa Rosa hunting. And that's me and him on St. George. I just wanted to fill the space. I thought it was cute. The picture here is two Sheldon-Jackson reindeer on St. George that became entangled whilst they were fighting. My dad took this before he unhooked them and ran very fast. My mother is a rural health practitioner and diabetes educator who worked often as the sole on-call health provider in many of the Aleutian villages we lived in, including Nikolsky and St. George. So from the age of 1, I was living in community and immersed in my culture. This is a photo of me in my first regalia for Atakan Akun dance group on St. George. Regalias for women are traditionally made from gut, seal skin, and other marine mammals called sach. You have to excuse my pronunciation. It might not be exactly on point, but we're working on it. These materials are still in use in Unangach regalia, making with the exception of some materials like suede. Men wore bentwood hats called chagudach, adorned with sea lion whiskers and also waterproof gut regalia. These hats are elaborately painted with distinctive shapes and are adorned with bone carvings and sea lion whiskers, or vibrissae. The design of a hat communicates many things, including being symbols of status and hunting prowess. The chaguda is a type of bill-shaped wooden hat made by boiling and steaming wood and bending it into shape, hence the term bentwood. So this is a really beautiful example. It's actually the work of my cousin Hugh Pelkey from Akutan. He so kindly sent these to me to show today. This hat is not complete. He's still adding kind of like ivory adornments to it, and he probably is going to add longer sea lion whiskers. But yeah, I thought it was a great, like, kind of contemporary example. So tattooing on the face in contemporary times has kind of just been temporary for dance, but there's been a resurgence of Unangach women who have chosen to get permanent traditional face tattoos. This is an example on my nana, or my auntie, Aquilina. Generally, the face tattoos are a series of dots and lines, and they signify your family line and your place in it. This is my second regalia in Nikolsky on Umnak Island on the left. Is it your left? Yeah. And then the next photo is on St. George about 7 years later for the Atakan Akun dance group. Atakan Akun means we are one. And this dance group regalias, I believe, are property of the Pribilof School District, whereas the one on the left is mine. And then more recently, I received my adult regalia. I chose it to graduate in, and I also chose to have different lines in the beads on my headdress, kind of made by different aunties, which was really good, but caused a little bit of frustration between everybody. Lots of seed beads and kind of like magnifying glasses. I was really fortunate to always be encouraged to create. As Unangak people, creativity is integral to our being and lifestyle, and the very reason we were able to survive for millennia in such extreme Arctic environments. Our creativity was and remains an act of both spirituality and utility. We had a few programs at school on the Pribilofs that taught us traditional skills such as bentwood hat making, regalia making, miniature ikyach or kayak construction, and Unangak basket weaving. We were also encouraged to use the animal products that existed from subsistence living, such as seal pelts, reindeer antlers, ivory, which washed up on the shores or was unearthed from the shoreline. It is unspoken knowledge that you use all pieces of an animal in as many ways as you can, out of respect for them gifting you their life. So the top left is miniature ikyach making with Mike Livingston, who's Unanga from Cold Bay. And then the bottom is bentwood hat making by Pat Gregory. And then also the black and white is Pat Gregory and kind of like famous hat maker Andrew Gronholt from Sandpoint, who is also Unanga. There's actually a book about him. I just put this in because it's like good to mention. It's a really nice book called Chagudach. And these are some ivory pieces and carvings that my dad created and has passed on to me. One of the practices I always found really mind-blowing growing up was that there was no like buffing technique to make the ivory soft. It was just holding it and like kind of like rubbing it and putting it in your pocket. And I always just thought sentimentally that's like really nice. Especially with like things that you're gifting to somebody. So many of the practices of using all of an animal have taken on more contemporary forms, as you can see with like the heart pendant my dad made, but also our famously hazardous reindeer antler Christmas tree, adorned with sea urchins and mussel shells. I think to Alaskans, this is like not a surprising piece of construction, but like if you weren't Alaskan, this would be surprising. Also, my childhood memories of this are so joyous and equally terrifying because the way that it would fall, like it wasn't really held up by anything. It just was like balanced. So it was a bit scary. But that added a little bit of fun to the festive season. So this is in Nikolsky with some of the feral horses. So growing up, I guess, like anything you experience when you're younger, you don't really realize how lucky you were to experience such freedom. This is especially true with St. George and Nikolsky. Playing out with your friends all day in the tundra while the village watches over you in this way is completely unheard of in urban life. Some of my earliest memories are luring some of the older feral horses in Nikolsky underneath the monkey bars of the playground and dropping down onto their backs through the gaps in the bars. There doesn't seem to be photographic evidence of this because we were really not allowed to do it and we hid it. But there is the photographic evidence of riding the local goats. So I feel like that's enough proof. Anyways, I'm still alive, so. What? And then another favorite memory of mine is the airport at Nikolsky. Not only did we have wild horses, but we also had cows, and the planes used to have to do like a bluff flyover to like scare the cows off the runway and then come in. I think sometimes they do it with helicopters now, but anyway. Also a favorite kind of like feature of the Nikolsky runway is the burnt out Douglas C-47A that crashed on takeoff. Well, it caught on fire on takeoff in 1965. Nobody died. We spent many days playing in it, pretending that it was still on fire. And I just think it's so funny because when new people come to the island and leave the island, it's like the first thing they see when they come, and it's the first thing they see when they leave. And I think it's hilarious to land on a runway with a crash plane at the end. And that's the goose. Sometimes that would just land on the lake. I don't think that's in service anymore. There was only like 2 of them left. So in amongst all of our antics, there was always this surreal underlying feeling, especially in Nikolsky, of living in parallel with other timelines. One of my earliest experiences of this was often hearing stories from elders of living in Ulach, or Barabra, the Russian word. We would hear the tales told in a hushed manner of shamanistic practices that occurred in these dwellings. Most elders had a degree of shame around these memories due to the demonization of shamanism during the Russian takeover. The Barabras in their stories were the same that existed within the middle of the modern town because Nikolsky was just built on top. It was Cholula, and then it was just built on top and built on top. The Barabras in their stories were the same that existed within the middle of the modern town, the same Barabras we played house in, imagining ourselves as those who lived there, imagining ourselves in these forbidden stories, our childhood fantasies expansive and adorned with the details of our ancestors' past worlds. That's my dad in Agnes's Ula in the middle of the town. And that's me. That's me in one of the dories, and then you can see the back of the Ulach in the background. Again, we weren't supposed to play in those, so sorry, Mum. She's probably listening. But yeah, because they collapse. I actually think these ones have collapsed now, which is unfortunate. So in this world of stories and community, there was always a very close connection with the land and understanding of our direct relationship with the environment and each other. Something that is understood as reciprocal and interconnected. The land and animals care for us by providing us food and sustainable environment to live in, and we care for the land and animals in return by using the entire animal when killed, never taking more than is needed, and passing down knowledge of correct seasons to hunt and which animals to take. This is something instilled in me mostly from my dad, but also commonly passed on by elders. As part of this reciprocity, giving out your kills or fish is an important custom in villages, and the best cuts of meat always go to the elders. On the Pribilofs, we were raised with the knowledge from these older generations of how these balances were greatly upset when Unangach were removed from ancestral lands on the Aleutian archipelago and taken to the Pribilofs and put into slavery by the Russian-American Company, and later America, for the purpose of the fur seal trade. Unangach were enslaved to mass slaughter the seals for pelts and only paid in cans of corned beef, which granted corned beef soup the name $1 Million Soup on the Pribilof Islands. This enslavement and subsequent forced hand in the cruelty and waste of animals we regarded so closely obviously caused great societal and in turn spiritual pain to the Unangach people. The Russian fur traders also disseminated sea otters on the Aleutian Islands and many Unangach people themselves. The book Slaves of the Harvest is a book recounting this history. There is also a song, Slaves of the Harvest, produced by Mac Senior Lestenkoff of St. Paul in 1978. It is sung and played by Mac Mandrigan Sr., Philip Lestenkoff, and Neon Krukoff Sr. At the time the song was produced, animal rights activists were negatively spotlighting the United States government managed commercial harvest, including the Pribilof Islands, Unangan involvement in it. The activists paid a visit in demonstration against the commercial harvest of fur seals, and the United States government did not defend the Unangan against these activists. The environmental damage from the extractive nature of the fur trade can still be seen today, and the forced harvest using Native people as pawns for capitalistic ventures is a deep collective wound. As you may have noticed, a central theme in both the St. George and Nikolsky communities was our proximity to elders. Much of my earliest memories was tagging along on medical home visits with my mum to check on elders, or being taken out into the tundra and shown different plants that are edible and non-edible. It is also where we receive a majority of oral history and knowledge. I pay homage to the late Bill Ermeloff and Simeon Pletnikoff, who instilled in me an understanding of plants and land in a context that could be seen as interchangeable with the medicine cabinet. Using plants and animal fats to heal themselves and prepare food is an oral tradition that I was fortunate to grow up with. I would routinely participate in walks and talks with these particular past elders, and it's something I will always greatly miss. When I was 13, we moved to Australia, where I finished high school. This move was in stark contrast to my rural community upbringing, but ironically had many similarities in regards to racial injustice. This came with a few unique challenges, one of which was the very obvious exposure to much larger cities, but also an introduction to just how insidious the universality of racism towards Indigenous people is in Western systems and structures, regardless of country. In small communities like the Pribilofs and Nikolsky, the effects of horror stories and social awareness of the impact of racial profiling are very obvious. We grow up not only with the historical knowledge of what happened to our people, but within the very environment these events created. I would witness overt racism towards my dad when we would visit Anchorage, and he would tell me countless stories of his experiences growing up. One of which always stuck with me was when he was 13. He and some of the kids from the island were flown into Anchorage on their way to Sitka to go to Mount Edgecombe. And on the night they stayed in the Anchorage hotel, they would not let them stay in the actual rooms, but made them sleep on the floor in the basement of the hotel, despite them paying full price. In moving to Australia, this realization of its widespread nature was not a shock, but the exposure to it without the buffer of community was disorientating in many ways, and in many ways paralyzing. Australia has a very similar history of removal and genocide with the Aboriginal people that's effects have continued to metastasize under systemic cleansing, lack of support by the government, and largely willfully ignorant population within white society. Being immersed in this environment at 13 was in many ways a bizarre experience. This experience was a first-hand realization of the importance of community, a lesson that was dealt to me purely by the sudden lack of it. Unspoken social understandings that I grew up around were suddenly non-existent, and the urban misunderstandings of Indigenous lifestyles and attitudes felt to me like a form of psychological violence that I had to actively protect myself from. A canon event in this was a young girl at my high school running a whole campaign against the hunting of seals by the Inuit in Greenland, um, putting flyers all around the school, framing it as kind of like this like unnecessary savagery that was happening by like this immoral group of people. Subsequently, the teachers at this high school decided to let her speak about it at the assembly, in which she further slandered the practice and its people. Whilst in hindsight, I understand that the girl was 14. The reaction of the adult teachers to agree and let her go up and speak on it will forever astound me. It is an event that led me, also only 14, to having to stand up in the same assembly to provide her the explanation of subsistence and how the environmental threats toward dying ecosystems are primarily from large companies, not small Indigenous communities. I never finished my defense because the teachers shut us both down and it was never mediated or spoken about again. This resulting silencing by figures of authority, along with the exposure of rife racism against Aboriginal culture and community in Australia, solidified in my teenage brain the belief in my lack of safety in just being who and what I was. It confirmed to me that relating to my Indigenous identity was not an option, and I began to actively reject that part of myself. During this time, I excelled at art because it was something that remained consistent in my life and served as a pocket of safety in my psyche. And these are some portraits from that time. After high school, I moved to Sydney. So I lived like 3 hours out of Sydney, so 3 hours south. And then when I was 17, I moved into Sydney itself. I studied animation despite being encouraged to study fine art by some really supportive art teachers. This utilitarian approach came from a complete lack of belief in the historical practice of documenting art. This was a result of the knowledge I grew up with of colonial institutions quite literally stealing our artifacts and studying our people as if they still did not exist. And I mean, this still happens, but not so much. I still kind of like harbor a pretty prominent disdain for academia, especially the lens that is like European patriarchal history. It just seems like the only kind of view that's bolstered, but that's changing slowly. So during this time, I became immersed in graffiti and all the facets of underground culture that come with that. I believe despite this early conscious rejection of parts of my identity, subconsciously I remained drawn to my creative nature as a way to connect with community, myself, and resist the institutional pressure I felt in my outer environment. This proximity and involvement to countercultures was a direct reflection of that. I found myself employed by an array of people, venues, and festivals to whom I still hold connections with, most notably performing with the Hallucination. Formerly, when I performed with them, they were called a Tribe Called Red from Six Nations on their Australian tour. And then also painting the debut album cover for Merciless Indian Savages. Many people know this, but it's just worth noting in the presentation that band name is just a reappropriation of how Indigenous people are described in the Declaration of Independence. Whilst I knew instinctively that my creativity was a tool, something that transcended a craft or special interest, I believe now that this is a tacit knowledge that sits outside of linear time. It is a form of collective dreaming that, even when not outwardly acknowledged, even by the dreamer, animates itself regardless. In Unanga, we call this kuga, which means spirits who assist. I want to share a piece of writing from during that time that I made in conjunction with a mural. A lot of my thoughts and style have developed since then, but I feel like this is kind of like a marker of where I was at. And I think the first time I felt like I had like a connection with spirits who assist, like Kuga. The first time my dad took me hunting, we were looking off a cliff into the ocean to see if any animals had started feeding, and I was so frustrated because I couldn't understand why he could see everything on the bottom and I couldn't. He told me my perspective was wrong because I was accepting the reflections of light off the water as the only reality and ignoring the translucent areas where the light wasn't hitting. Strange, but the process of this painting has been reminding me so much of that moment and how reliant we are on a fixed perspective to dictate our world when something so simple can flip an entire field of vision on its head. It's hilarious and humbling that we walk around with billions of different lenses, all existing simultaneously, yet we're only able to put together our picture with the bits of light we accept. I like the idea that we catch occasional glimpses of true reality churning beneath the surface of the flimsy and fractured human perception we call ours. It seems that whilst we are busy attributing so much importance to childish surface matters, like where the light hits and where it doesn't, right ways to look at it and wrong ways to look at it, it just continues on existing, supporting our delusions in silence, seemingly knowing that a mere centimeter of its depth would be far too powerful and complex for us to even begin to process. I slowly began to move away from murals and commissions in order to cultivate my personal work. More often than not, mixed media paintings featuring bird collages made of real cut-up currency, receipts, and other urban detritus. I suppose this is like a clumsy metaphor for like, I think I was like in my early 20s when I made this. So I think for like the birds, I think were like a metaphor for freedom and the way it exists in our like colonial ecosystems. Despite feeling a fulfillment in my practice as I reached my mid-20s, I could no longer digest the lack of place I felt. I slowly grew out of certain artistic communities and began to attempt to move into more professional spaces. Unsurprisingly, I found myself unable to digest the environments that these spaces provided. I've always been somewhat hyper-aware of my plight of being someone Indigenous who is white passing and heteronormative and all of the other things. And the fact that that comes with a generous serving of privilege and safety. The ability to have a choice of camouflage in settings you know you will be discriminated against or both willfully and unwillfully misunderstood has given me a huge advantage in colonial spaces that I probably will never be able to quantify. In the same breath, this has also had an immense psychological consequence on my sense of self, especially in my younger years where I chose to remain hidden. The ability to code switch is not new. In some ways, I see it as a playful trickster sort of energy, something that has helped me form alliances with a wide range of people and something that has provided an armor in areas where I know alliances are not an option. Unfortunately, this armor only protects you outwardly. I like to call it an armor lined with nails because they may not be able to see you for who you truly are, but you can see them for who they are, and it can lead to some incredibly painful realizations about our modern world. You become a fly on the wall to horrific racism that sits quite comfortably in the psyches of people in your direct environment. People with power, influence, colleagues, bosses, and peers. People in kind of like quote unquote respectable positions. You are constantly presented with a choice to reveal yourself and possibly sever an opportunity, breach your own safety, or create an enemy, or digest this hatred internally and move through and above it. Both choices are exhausting, both choices detrimental to physical and mental health if executed incorrectly. This process of metabolization is what I believe has changed my relationship to my practice and community forever. And this is a piece of writing that I wrote kind of while I was in this discomfort, sort of armor lined with nails. This writing was when I began to reach for the catharsis of expressing my discomfort as a way to process it. Again, not a very new concept, but I have come to see it as a way to metabolize hatred and venom. When I began to make more of a clear correlation, it occurred to me that there was a spiritual / perceptual mechanics to this process that involved a world far beyond my own. I started to reflect on how these processes of tacit knowledge are intrinsically self-governing, and the ability to recognize that in ourselves serves as a direct act of resistance to the two-dimensional tropes that academia and colonial society reduces us to. Specifically for me, the Indigenous and female identity, both the demonization and the romanticization of it. This confirms to me that my journey on its own is inherently unangach. It is an embodied experience of coming up against these environments as they repeatedly attempt to define me. During this time of silence, I would witness my past selves through my older creations and come to understand myself as connected to everything in a non-linear way, much as I experienced in my childhood in the village, cyclical and reciprocal. So I sat deeply with the discomfort I felt around my identity, inquiring into this act of defense against the world I had come to know. In doing this, I thought about the barrier I felt beyond surface misunderstandings. I had always felt this divide in how I was perceiving my reality when moved to a Western environment, but never really articulated it beyond feeling as if I was running on some sort of attached yet parallel dimension. I began reading content from Indigenous scholars and found some things I deeply related to, especially in the book Research is Ceremony by Sean Wilson. So Sean Wilson is Indigenous Canadian, but I found him particularly interesting because he lives and lectures in Australia. He outlines The main focus of this book rests with the positive effects of maintaining, transmitting, and clarifying an Indigenous way of doing and being in the research process, the basis of an Indigenous research paradigm. In amongst the recognition of the paternalistic relationship the colonial world has with Indigenous people, he spoke of differences in base perception that resonated with me deeply. He says, a separation of those areas called science from those called art and religion. The Indigenous knowledge base, on the other hand, integrates those areas of knowledge so that science is both religious and aesthetic. We find then an emphasis in the Western tradition of approaching knowledge through the use of intellect. For Indigenous people, knowledge is also approached through the senses and intuition. Absorbing this was a confirmation of what I had been feeling, a deep incongruence, especially in perceptions of community, connection, and perception of time. This led me kind of down a rabbit hole where I discovered the concept of chronemics. Chronemics is, as described by Wikipedia, an anthropological, philosophical, and linguistic subdiscipline that describes how time is perceived, coded, and communicated across a given culture. It is one of the several subcategories to emerge from the study of nonverbal communication. And within chronemics consists monochronic and polychronic time. Monochronic time, as defined by Wikipedia, is a time system that means things are done one at a time and time is segmented into small, precise units. Under this system, time is scheduled, arranged, and managed. The United States considers itself a monochronic society. This perception came about during the Industrial Revolution. Many Americans think of time as a precious resource not to be wasted or taken lightly. As communication scholar Edward T. Hall wrote regarding the Americans' viewpoint of time in the business world, the schedule is sacred. Hall says that for monochronic cultures such as the American culture, time is tangible and viewed as a commodity where time is money or time is wasted. John Ivers, a professor of cultural paradigms, agrees with Edward Hall by stating, in the market sense, monochronic people consume time. The result of this perspective is that monochronic cultures place a paramount value on schedules, tasks, and getting the job done. Polychronic time, on the other hand, is a time system that means getting several things done at once. In polychronic time systems, a wider view of time is exhibited, and time is perceived in large fluid sections. Examples of polychronic cultures are Latin America, African, Arab, South Asian, Mediterranean, and Native American cultures. These cultures' view on time can be connected to natural rhythms, the earth, and the seasons. These analogies can be understood and compared because natural events can occur spontaneously and sporadically, just like polychronic time-oriented people and polychronic time-oriented cultures. A scenario would be an Inuit, and this is funny because this was on Wikipedia, so I didn't put this in here, but a scenario would be an Inuit working in a factory in Alaska. The superiors blow a whistle to alert for break times, etc. The Inuit are not fond of that method because they determine their times by the sea tides, how long it takes place, and how long it lasts. In polychronic cultures, time spent with others is considered a task and of importance to one's daily regimen. Polychronic cultures are much less focused on the preciseness of accounting for time and more on tradition and relationships rather than on tasks. Polychronic societies have no problem being late for an appointment if they are deeply focused on some work or in a meeting that ran past schedule. Because the concept of time is fluid and can easily expand or contract as need be. As a result, polychronic cultures have a much less formal perception of time. They are not ruled by precise calendars and schedules. After reading about these two different functions of time, I realized pretty quickly what half of the uncomfortability had been. In community, we grow up with what's commonly referred to as island time, which I'm sure many people are familiar with here. What I have now come to understand is a layman's term for polychronic. In summer, as children, we play outside in the 2 a.m. sun, watched over by community, coming home only when our parents call us on the VHS, on the shared channel. I don't know if you guys have that here, but we just had like a shared channel on the VHS. Yeah. And then everyone's like hey, can you go to channel 10? And then everyone goes to channel 10. You can hear them all clicking on. Our community movements are completely dictated by seasons, movements of animals. We hunt and fish runs. Our perception of time and connectedness expanding and contracting with the tides. Often a vague nod at the store relates to a visit with someone later. Planes come when the time is right or circle back for another day. Everything happens in its own time, but somehow still gets done. This rhythmic and expansive understanding of time is echoed in my fellow Unanga, Dr. Haley Hannah Stepperton's PhD work, stating, Unanga time does not privilege the four seasons in ways that people of more southern or temperate climates south of the 49th parallel interior might. Since Unanga do not experience four explicit seasons in ways that other geographies might, my work instead privileges the differing subsistence, processes, and performances dependent on migrations of more than human relatives across the Unanga understanding of time through seasons. This intentional shift exposes our human survivance as inherently entangled with migration patterns and corresponding Unanga protocols and performances for the chiluzas or returns and departures of more than human relative across seasons and cycles. In this way, Unanga understandings of time do not only privilege a changing season, but also pay attention to the changing protocols and performances marked by returns or departures of more than human relatives, moon cycles and tidal shifts, and environmental patterns. This is my dad washing myrrh eggs that we used to get, and then we would make myrrh egg kind of like pie and stuff. And we'd also blow them because the eggs are really beautiful. That's sea urchins. And there's us hunting pogies, which I think are a rockfish. I don't know. I just remember being scared of them. And this is in Nikolsky as well. This is just halibut fishing off of the beach. More Nikolsky. It became very apparent in hindsight that so much of my vying for connection outside of man-made capitalistic gasps of time between the strike of 9 to 5 in my move to the city was a subconscious attempt at recreating these natural cycles of community and environment. To be tacitly connected to a building beyond its function, to connect to peers beyond the forced socialization of school and work, really was to take advantage of the longer evenings and go roam around abandoned warehouses, painting on buildings, listening to each other's music, exploring terrain that isn't the sidewalk or a bike lane. Unfortunately, and I guess very obviously, it was impossible to simulate this experience of being connected to non-human counterparts and seasons of subsistence. But even these small gaps of escape into timeless time were enough to mimic the kinship and polychronic nature of village life and hold me over in many ways. So during this part of the talk, you're just going to see photos of my work. I didn't label them because I didn't like the aesthetic of it, but you can look on my website if you are so curious about the labels. I see now that this experience of what seems to be two polar opposite environments in my childhood and young adulthood are inseparable. Without my time in environmentally and community-connected polychronic systems, I would have never noticed the embodied difference in a monochronic system. My witnessing of monochronic dominant Western systems draws me to conclude that more often than not, these structures will sacrifice the authenticity of an emotional experience to remain on schedule. An example would be an almost pathological preoccupation with individual preservation at the expense of community, richness of life, experience, and free play. Ironically, this extractive approach removes our ability to witness without motive and subsequently robs the collective of the wisdom that comes with that. This is a grave misstep, as this is the very wisdom that provides us the utility of a precise internal collective compass. The constant drive to self-produce in a militant, linear, ever-ascending, ever-improving fashion is not an accurate representation of the natural world of which we are a part of, and renders an entire zeitgeist blind to infinite patterns of learning that lend themselves to polychronic styles of thinking. This system collectively alters the Western experience of time and spatial relation. It strips it of all perceived unnecessary symbolism unless it is useful in the moment. An example of a society that is engaging in this stripping would be a society saturated with branding instead of art, which we currently live in if you are in a city. It renders us unable to appreciate nuance, to live widely, expansively, and in a way that prioritizes connection to our human and non-human counterparts. This is, in my opinion, incredibly dangerous to have as a collective mindset. Whilst I do believe both styles of relating, polychronic and monochronic thinking, are valid and useful, the domination of one or the other, which in the Western context is monochronic, has the potential to and has already begun to metastasize in both the climate crisis and the collective mental health crisis. Part of this crisis of individuality and illusion of a linear world is a literal and symbolic disconnectedness from life cycle. Witnessing the death of animals at your own hand in subsistence settings is something sacred, a ritual. It viscerally harnesses us to our awareness of place in the environment. I found many of my internal sentiments echoed in the work of philosopher Byung-Chul Han, specifically his book, The Disappearance of Ritual, where he says, "Rituals are processes of embodiment and bodily performances. In them, the valid order and values of a community are physically experienced and solidified. They are written into the body, incorporated, that is, physically internalized. Thus, rituals create a bodily knowledge and memory, an embodied identity, a bodily connection. A ritual community is a communal body, as there is a bodily dimension inherent to community." This is further echoed in the article, Cultural Identity, Mental Health, and Suicide Prevention, What Can We Learn from Unangach Culture, by Unangach researchers O'Rourke, Kachutin, and Reedy, where they directly link the reconnection of embodied traditional practices to increases in emotional resilience. From my personal experience, I believe subsistence gifts the participant with a tangible link to and heightened awareness of the global fascia. I often think it is possible the collective discomfort that we feel encroaching on modern life is the product of individual severances from the fascia via our growing lack of ability to perceive it. Much is being explored around post-traumatic stress experienced through DNA, particularly in more Indigenous peoples. Research has isolated that trauma can leave a chemical mark on a person's genes, which can then be passed down to future generations. This mark doesn't cause a genetic mutation, but it does alter the mechanism by which the gene is expressed. This alteration is not genetic, but epigenetic. And epigenetic is kind of like a buzzword right now, but it is making a little bit of headway. So research into intergenerational trauma has made definitive progress in the past 4 and 5 years. The findings are moving us closer to understanding that the disruption of connection to cultural ways is weighted beyond simply being a little more anxiety prone. Bader, in his paper, says association between gene methylation and experiences of historical trauma in Alaska Native peoples, notes that massive group traumas such as genocide, loss of land and foodways, and forced conversion to Western lifeways may be embodied and affect individuals, families, communities, cultures, and health. Perhaps this is part of the utility within my own work, manifesting a reclamation of personal narrative, which by default serves as an internal talisman of protection and empowerment. Compasses, clocks, and caustics, my talk today, or my oration, has drawn into reflection my knowledge gained through youth and adulthood, which has not been acquired from institutional learning. The knowledge reflected in this discussion is an ongoing weave. The oration is my journey as an Indigenous woman in heavily contrasting environments through a polychronic lens. In contrast, a monochronic lens would describe this as a talk through an autoethnographic construct. To witness the dance between monochronic linear time and polychronic nonlinear time, and articulating the ways in which these different perceptions of directionality have molded my own approach to life, creativity, and connection is a constantly evolving weave with no end. My Nana Aquilina Lestenkoff put it beautifully when she said, "There is never a finished basket, as I start another one before I end the first one, as they are all connected." Excavating fascia memory as a way to communicate to my future and past selves, ancestors, non-human and human alike, has been and will remain a cornerstone of my personal practice, something that I hope serves less as a self-aggrandizing mission and more as an act of perceptual cartography, a cartography which can be referenced and added to freely at any latitude or longitude the clock hand strikes, past, present, and future. That's it. Yes. And I have 2 pages of references. I don't know if I should. I'll just flash them in case when it's recorded, someone wants to pause it. And that's me really conveniently making a like my first sculpture in front of the front door and telling everybody that they can't use the front door until it naturally disintegrates.
It makes the rest of us feel sort of shallow. That was really good. Did you just write that?
Just this morning. No. No, I spent a few like months like working out what I was talking about, but yeah, it was really nice. It was nice to be able to like, I was saying to Jackie earlier, it was just nice to have the opportunity to solidify all of those thoughts in one thing. Because you know how you always think these things, but you don't actually like put them into something you can perceive yourself. So yeah.
Is it part of a degree situation?
No.
Yeah.
School of Hard Knocks. Yeah. That was
So where's the painting you were?
in there. Right now?
Yeah.
Which one? In there. Yeah, in the other room. Yeah, it's just I wouldn't bring it in here because it's like too hard to do. But yeah. Yes.
Thinking about how it's not really the last 4 years and the degree program. How do you feel, when do you feel most connected to your home? Because you do have this obvious strong connection, persistence, and your father, and all of your family members. And you answered that within your presentation, talking about connections. You're replicating that polychromatic time through your graffiti work and your socialization in Sydney. But what else speaks to your heart connecting you to home?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think it's like narrative. Like I feel like because I moved around a lot as a kid, I get more attached to like story, I think, because that's what I had from like my elders and everything, and like practice, like my own personal practice. That's something that really grounds me. And to me, it provides kind of like an invisible tether between all the places I've been. And so I don't feel like I'm not home, like kind of like anywhere, if that makes sense. But that took a while to cultivate. I definitely didn't always feel like that. Yeah.
That was my question. From Pop and your various locations of different you live. My question was, where is home? And I thought I get a better question. What is home?
So I think what is home again is like practice for me. Like that's what I always come back to. Story. Where is home? I think it's like a lot of places. I don't really mind going anywhere. Yeah, it doesn't bother me at all. Again, that wasn't always the case. Like I think there was a period of my life where I like didn't really know because a lot of my friends had like friendships from like when they were very small all the way up until kind of like high school, and then they had that really like long continued friendships. I actually do have that. It's just that I hadn't geographically gone back and visited. So like now that's kind of been like that circle has been closed. So yeah, I think everywhere. But I I find it really hard to compare. I mean, I said in my talk like how Australia and America are very similar in like their genocidal tendencies, and that can like replicate in the culture a little bit, but they're also really, really different, like as far as like climate and stuff like that. So I find them kind of incomparable. Like when I'm here, I miss Australia if I'm here for a long time. And then when I'm in Australia, I miss Alaska because yeah, they're not comparable. I think like also because Australia is just like it's not volcanic, like even geographically, it's just like a flat kind of surface. So you don't get the same experience, I guess. It's vast. They're both vast. They're just vast in different ways. Yeah.
Maybe you're just at home with yourself.
Yeah, maybe.
Wherever you-
Won't speak too soon.
See if we have any questions in the chat.
Yeah.
And another question, Denali, what medium do you think you might attempt next that you haven't tried yet?
Well, I'm planning on coming back. I really want to go back to the Pribilofs next year. Probably not St. George because it's only like a small amount of people. But I would like to incorporate, like we learned to weave when I was younger. I just kind of like suck at it now. So I'd kind of like to re-emerge into those practices a little bit and see what would happen. Because I'm always mixing mediums. So it would be cool to see if I kind of like leaned more into that. If I could like play with that a little bit. Yeah.
And if anyone has any questions from the audience, you're welcome to type in the chat or raise your hand. We can unmute you. Please feel free to ask or to make a comment.
My mom in the chat has this started.
Oh. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties. We couldn't get it to connect to the screen here. Thanks for your patience, everybody. Okay, well, any last questions from the audience? And if not, I'll just remind you that our community feedback for the interpretive plan to help influence the museum and to give your thoughts on our space needs, our public programs, the gallery, etc. That'll be tomorrow at 4:30 p.m. here, also on Zoom. I can give you a copy of the plan, or you can get it online at Exhibit AK /SJM. And you can also attend the meeting at 1 p.m. on Wednesday if you can't make it tomorrow. So we'd love to see you.
Are there other things that Denali's gonna be doing, public interfacing stuff?
Yeah, Denali has been painting away. She might use all of her canvas before she leaves town, it seems like.
So the museum's open.
I'll be here just painting.
Yeah, we're
Yeah.
open Wednesday through Saturday, from 10 o'clock until 4 p.m. And there's a calendar. I'm happy to give you a copy. That shows the days and times. Of course, you know, there are points in the day, in the middle of the day, she's not here, but happy to share that with you. And she's here until the 24th. And then sadly, she leaves. And we don't have another artist in residence until 2025. So it's been we had prior to her, Tina Harness, who's a really tremendous beater, James Buchich, who does form line art, especially painting and drawing. We had Lisa Lynch, and we had Neva Mathias. and then Denali. So it's been a number of months. Usually the residency program is 5 or 6 months long. It's a huge part of what we do. And if you'd like to find out how to support it more, you can talk to JJ Carlson, who's the office manager for the Friends. And write thank you notes to the National Endowment for the Arts, that kind of thing. So thank you guys for coming. Really appreciate it. I hope you have a wonderful Indigenous Peoples Day, and please spend time with Denali if you can. Thank you.